Hello, everyone. We are back with Kim. I am so excited to hear you read, but also to just kind of get to know you a little bit. I'm
Sure.
just going to jump right in because actually I've had a lot of people talk to me about this book and just kind of like, oh, I'm so excited. Like Coleman Hill blends family history with fiction to trace a great migration story to suburban New Jersey. How did writing this novel change the way you understand your own upbringing, and what fiction allowed you to explore that history in ways that a straight memoir could not?
Well, I would say, first of all, I was interested in my family's upbringing, but I would say within writing this, there was always a dialogue between how I was raised and how my family members were raised, because I wanted to know, first of all, why they treat each other the way that they did. Um, there was a lot of abuse in the family. There was alcoholism in the family. I wanted to know where these problems came from. What happened in people's childhoods that would make them do these things. And the reason why I chose fiction, honestly, is because as I tell people, I was not alive in the 1940s. So I could not, I grew up hearing these stories from my mother, her siblings, my aunts, but and I had always had a vivid imagination, so I could imagine things and picture things, but I wasn't alive then, nor was I able to witness these events firsthand. So I had to use my fiction skills to invent, a full picture. What were they wearing in these occasions? What did they say to each other specifically in these occasions? And also looking at the way that memory works, right? Because you have all these different siblings and everyone th saw or remembered things a little bit differently, right? Or had a different emotional experience with certain events. So I wanted to put in all those varying perspectives, and arguments and disagreements about what exactly happened, what exactly was the truth. So fiction could do that, but memoir could not.
I know. I mean, I just love. It's kind of like auto fiction, kind of like this weird.
Yeah.
Like I love what you can do with that.
Yes.
Um, the Great Migration is often framed as a movement to cities, but your novel centers suburban New Jersey. What
Yes.
does placing this story in the suburbs reveal about race, belonging, aspiration that we might otherwise miss? I think that's why people really like it because they're like, yeah, that's
Yeah.
more like my story. I'm not from
Yeah,
the Bronx.
exactly. Well, first of all, I am from New Jersey. I'm a suburbanite myself, Jersey girl through and through. And the thing is, when you hear about the Great Migration, you always hear about Harlem, Detroit, Chicago, even LA, big, big cities, but for a lot of Black people, they don't live in the big cities. They didn't grow up in the big, sprawling projects. They didn't have that same experience. And so for me, it was looking at those differences of how people in the suburbs, experience life. And especially for Vauxhall, I did actually minimal like official research for this book, but somewhere I saw a notation that Vauxhall was one of the first integrated towns in New Jersey, right? And so you have to think like in the early 1900s, you had European immigrants coming here as well as African American migrants coming up from the South, and the European immigrants were not entrenched in the idea that they were white people, so they could actually like talk to their Black neighbors and mingle with them. My mother describes going across the street, and going into this white woman's house just like they were even more than family, and eating food from her refrigerator, whereas family, if you came in, oh, put napkins on your lap, don't touch this, don't do that, you're too loud, these types of things. So there was this type of camaraderie between neighbors, so you had that aspect going on where it was maybe at least in Vauxhall, a little bit more integrated, than let's say a Harlem, which was like a sprawling kind of Black Mecca. You had all these interactions between the European immigrants and the Black migrants. Um, yeah, so I definitely wanted to look at that aspect and look at, a small community because for me, when I would go to Vauxhall as a kid, Vauxhall has been split by 78, but it used to not be there when my mother was growing up. And she talked about how they would cross through the woods and go to school, to Union High School. But even with that, like we never went more than, let's say, like 3 or 4 blocks away from where she used to live or from where we used to have the barbecues at which is where her grandmother used to live. And to think that like your world was just a small, really small space. Whereas like maybe in a city, you'd have like blocks and blocks and you're on the subway maybe or taking buses here and there, but their world was so small, so to also look at that difference, what is it like to be in this little community where everybody knows each other, and for kids, like something that they described was that, if you cause trouble out in the street, your family would know it before you got home because like you'd be like beaten by adults down the street like people wouldn't let you get away with things back then, so there was this kind of like everyone looking out for each other type of feel.
Yes, and your work has been recognized by institutions like the NAACP Image
Yes,
Awards, the Carol Shields Prize. How do
yes.
you balance like writing and deeply personal, historically grounded stories with the public life of a book once it enters the literary world? And especially your history, like people are probably
Yeah.
always kind of like, "Oh, I know." Like, do you feel like possessive, or are you kind of like, "Okay, now it's like a public book, so I just gotta like accept that."
Yeah, I mean, it took me a very, very long time to get a book published. I've written tons of other manuscripts. I've been writing since I was a child, basically, and aspired to publish when I was very young, and so just hearing how other authors have felt once their books are in the world, and I just realized, you know what, you have no control over what's going to happen. You don't have no control over how the book is going to sell, how the book will be marketed, who will gravitate towards the book. Sometimes you might have an audience in mind. And then it surprises you who shows up to your readings and who resonates with your characters. So for me, it was like, okay, when I was writing the book and finalizing the book, am I satisfied with this? Am I comfortable with the story that I'm projecting about my family? Because I'm talking about some deeply traumatic and very personal aspects of my family, and so for me, my big thing was wanting to get my own statement out ahead of the game. And so one thing that I like to emphasize is that I'm not writing one trauma porn, because especially with Black folks, it's already hard to have certain narratives be out there in the publishing world, and at the time that my book sold, it was post 2020 George Floyd, and so now all of a sudden there's this increased interest in Black history and slavery and trauma. And, and some people might get the idea, oh, that's all that Black history is. It's suffering and pain, you know? And I think my book, a lot of the themes point to that, but also there's much more than that in my book. There is love in my book. There is humor in my book, so that even as children are plotting to kill their grandmother, which is a true story according to my mother, you're laughing because some of the stuff is really funny, even though it's twisted funny, right? So, but for me, I wanted to make sure to get the word out. This is my intention in putting this book out. I'm not putting this book out to defame my family. In fact, I struggled so much in representing them because, I didn't know ultimately why they treated each other these ways, and so I was trying to go into their psychology and their histories and try to figure out, a reasoning for this, so, and I feel like honestly, I represented some of my family members better, than how they've been described in family stories, because some of them have just been completely villainized, within the family. So that's one thing that I wanted to do intentionally just to get my own messaging out there. But honestly, like I can't control how people will receive my work, and I'm fine with that because ultimately, there have been people in my audiences who've picked up on things that even I, with all my understanding, and editing and feedback and all this kind of stuff, someone will give some insight at a reading, like I'm like, oh wow, oh, I never even thought of that. Right. So to me, that's fascinating.
Well, I think the thing is interesting is that, you're kind of almost telling a different story because it's not so, because of the suburban story. And so a
Hmm.
lot of times that's the first time someone's heard that story. So it's like they're like, "Oh, okay." But then they have to understand just like there are many Black urban stories, there are many Black suburban stories.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
kind of like don't get caught up in the single story. This my story, but your story might
Exactly.
be slightly different. But
Exactly.
yeah, but I'm excited about your forthcoming, like your novel Saltwater Sister, and it
Yes.
moves between the 1700s and the present, linking like women's resistance to enslavement with contemporary fights for reparations. What drew you to that long historical arc, and how did your Fulbright research in Ghana shape the story that you're telling?
Yeah, so I studied abroad in Ghana when I was in college, and that just like flipped my world upside down. Learning all this stuff about the slave trade, which I'd never learned in school before, and especially learning how the women were treated, because the fact is that so many of the women were raped, and to learn that when they became pregnant, so they were holding cells and also castles that the Europeans built along the West African coast since the 1400s. And if women became pregnant, at least in the part of Africa that I'm looking at, which is a small part of Ghana, they would not be sent across the ocean. They'd be kept in town. And sometimes they'd be servants or even enslaved to local families. So I was like, well, what was that experience like to be a woman and to bear this, child that's you don't want on top of, losing your family and your community and all this kind of stuff. So for me, that got me to thinking, and I wanted to do the Fulbright to go back and do more research and really dig deep into this community, which is Elmina. Elmina, you had one of the oldest and largest of the slave trading castles in the entirety of West Africa. You also had the largest mixed race population or one of the largest mixed race populations in West Africa, which might strike some people to hear. But these European men who were trading along the coast, they oftentimes, most times, did not bring their wives with them or families with them. And so they took up with local women, so there was rape going on, but there were also unions between these European men and African women, and babies were being made, right? And these babies, these children would be sent to Europe even to get educated, and they would come back to Africa and so forth. So there were just so many stories coming out of the research and things that blew my mind because let's say I decided to set the story in the 18th century specifically because there's one real life historical figure in the book, and he was the first African man to earn a PhD in the 1700s in the Netherlands. And his story has just tripped me out because he was sent back to Ghana. He was enslaved as a little boy, captured, put on a boat, taken to the Netherlands where he was raised. He got his PhD. And he went back to Ghana to be the chaplain for the white men at the slave trading. Yes. His story always
What?
makes people like drop their mouths open. So imagine me hearing this story for the first time at the slave castle. And his story just gets wilder and wilder because his PhD, so first African man to get a PhD, his dissertation defends the slave trade using the Bible as evidence. Now he's a chaplain for these white men in Elmina, and he wants to marry a local woman because he, doesn't remember where he came from in Africa. He doesn't speak the language, doesn't know the culture, and he's trying to marry this local woman. His superiors in Amsterdam refuse. And so their solution is to send him a white woman, put a white woman on a boat and send her to Ghana, to Africa, to marry this black man. So things like that, so many stories like that just blew my mind because this is a time when, the idea of like race and this racial hierarchy isn't fully entrenched as we know today. There was no like solid, this is black, this is white, you're inferior, we're superior. You had a lot of that going on even within the local society, right? And so I wanted to really look at all the complexities there. And also, me as a person in Ghana in the early 2000s on my Fulbright, I was just learning so much about how people there perceive us, being the descendants of enslaved people, and the fact that it's like a double standard, like they recognize that we're descendants, but then also we're treated like white people. And so like people will literally call me a white woman. Um, and wonder like when I could dance, they'd be like, "Oh, I didn't know you white people could dance," and
That's funny.
saying things like, "Oh, why don't you perm your hair because that's so much more beautiful?" And I'm just like, "Oh my God, like stay out of the sun so you don't get too dark," And so like just seeing how like colonialism, had just influenced people there. I wanted to put all of this stuff into a book. I actually wrote a memoir about my experiences there, because there was just so much that was happening to me that at the time I didn't see people talking about. But very soon after, Saidiya Hartman published her book Lose Your Mother, which people might know, and then of course, yeah, Jesse Homegoing. But at that time, like no one was talking about any of this stuff really, like outside the academic world. And so I was like, I got to write about this. People need to know about this. It's a fascinating history, and history will repeat itself, because people are already forgetting the things that happened back then. So history is a really important theme for my work and how history repeats itself. So within Coleman Hill, I'm looking at history within the family and that kind of like micro context. And with Saltwater Sister, it's definitely the broader, societal implications.
Wow, that is I'm so excited. I'm excited already. I'm like, oh my gosh, that sounds like a amazing. I feel like I have like one last question.
Sure.
Um, Across like both your novels, women, especially Black women, are the center of survival and memory and resistance. Like, why was
Yes.
that important for you? Like, why is it like, are you trying to inspire people? Like, is that just because it's like this is your story and this is a story that you know and this is what you're like,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
say like saying, or just like you want to give a
Yeah.
diversity of Black women. Like, look, we have all kinds of Black women and look at them.
Yeah.
And
I mean, what you just said, basically. And what we know is true that we have a diversity of Black women and experiences, but not everybody recognizes that. Like I said, some people think that Black people are just one thing or two things, right? And so I like to show the array, and to challenge people's perspectives. That like in Coleman Hill, you have someone like the character who represents my grandmother, who might be seen as weak. She was seen as weak by her own children, because she couldn't stand up to her mother-in-law, she couldn't stand up to her husband, she couldn't defend her children, but at the same time, I challenge that perspective because this is someone who was kicked out of the house by her mother-in-law, and somehow she managed to get herself from little old Vauxhall, New Jersey, all the way to Brooklyn, with a new husband and a new family where she was treated a lot better, right? So I challenge that perspective. Was she really weak, right? But yeah, she couldn't stand up to this woman, and this woman, my great grandmother, no one could stand up to her. Even grown men, they say were shaking in their shoes, when they would see her walking down the street. So yeah, I wanted to show like the diversity because we are diverse just like any other human being.
oh, exactly. That is so true. That's kind of like behind my little thing. I have person up there because I'm like I'm a person. Like I mean that's like weird, like type of thing.
No,
Anyway,
no.
it was so great to talk to you. I'm so excited to like meet you in person, to hear
Yes,
you read on March
likewise.
22nd. I've had so many wonderful readers, and the thing is so weird is that I didn't expect you all to say yes.
Ah.
You all could be features on your own. I'm like, oh no, what a
Hey, we're
wonderful,
storytellers.
that's what a wonderful problem to have. Like, oh my gosh, what a wonderful problem to have. And also just to be like talking about people and people be like, oh, I know that person and blah, 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 blah.
Yes.
And like outside the academy, that is so
Mhm.
great. But also too, I'm in awe of, you're doing fiction, but you're also doing scholarship. Like that is something
Yeah.
that I think a lot of people don't understand, like the importance of people doing scholarship and research for people's practices. So thank you
Yes.
for that, Kim. That's like
Oh, no
really,
problem.
really important.